Imagine this. You're dressed in layers of petticoats, corsets, and a giant hoop skirt the size of a small tent. You're attending a royal ball, sipping tea with nobles, when suddenly nature calls. Now what? How do you lift all that fabric? Where do you even go? And perhaps most importantly, how on earth did women menstruate in those dresses? Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of elegance, strict decorum, and some downright baffling hygiene challenges. For decades, Victorian women were swathed in crinolines and voluminous dresses. Queen Victoria herself was a fashion icon who set the standard for this style. These puffy garments symbolized ideals of femininity, grace, and decorum. Yet, beneath the grandeur lay a daily struggle that most history books neglect to mention. In the early Victorian era, flushing toilets and underground sewers were mere fantasies. Europeans had not yet embraced the very concept of the toilet. When nature called, you answered wherever you happened to be. The old saying, "When you've got to go, was a fact of life. With no indoor plumbing, people relieved themselves wherever they could, behind trees, in open fields, or right inside their homes. Yes, you heard that right, inside. Have you ever heard someone say they didn't have a pot to piss in? That wasn't just a colorful insult. It was a brutal reality. The pot referred to a chamber pot, a simple bowl used for collecting urine and feces. If you didn't own one, your only option was to step outside and hope for privacy. And the streets? Oh, they reeked. Victorians tossed the contents of these pots straight out the window, right onto the cobblestones below. High-heeled shoes and umbrellas weren't just fashion statements. They were survival gear in a city where the sky could rain waste. The chamber pot, often called a jerry in British slang, was a household staple. It came with a lid, and once used, the lid was sealed tightly. That lid wasn't just for courtesy. It was a warning. This pot is full. Approach at your own risk. In the grand homes of the Victorian elite, nobles, and royals, you might never see a chamber pot, but don't be fooled. They were everywhere, hidden in ornate cabinets, tucked inside decorative furniture, or discreetly built into chairs. Servants scurried through the halls, checking and emptying them multiple times a day, because even wealth couldn't escape the call of nature. If you had money, your bathroom might be a private wooden bench with a chamber pot tucked inside. But no matter how elegant the home, one question lingered: where did all that waste go? Enter the garderobe, a medieval-style toilet built on the upper floors of buildings, often hanging precariously over streets or alleyways. When it was time to empty the pot, the answer was simple: open the window and toss. To avoid drenching unfortunate passers-by, a shout would ring out, "Garde l'eau," French for "watch out for the water." A polite warning that something very impolite was about to fall from above. The stench was unbearable. Homes reeked, streets overflowed, and entire cities drowned in their own filth. Some streets even had raised stone steps so pedestrians could leap over the running waste. Here's the kicker. During the Napoleonic and English Civil Wars, government agents went door to door collecting chamber pot contents. Why? Because urine. Yes, urine was refined into saltpeter, a crucial ingredient in making gunpowder. Your pee was quite literally fueling war. And what about the women draped in layers of crinolines, petticoats, overskirts, and bodices? So many fabric layers that undergarments like knickers weren't even necessary. With all that fabric swishing around, no one noticed what wasn't underneath. For much of the Victorian era, ladies walked around without knickers. It wasn't until the late period, when those massive bell-shaped crinolines began catching gusts of wind and flipping women over in public, that society whispered, perhaps it's time for drawers. But these weren't what you're thinking. Early Victorian underwear was crotchless pant legs connected only at the waist with a split down the middle where it mattered most. Overlapping flaps of cotton offered just enough coverage until a woman squatted, at which point they parted like curtains on a stage. Why? Because ladies weren't about to lift 20 pounds of petticoats, shifts, and skirts every time nature called. These open-crotched drawers allowed a woman to lower herself over a chamber pot, gracefully and discreetly without bearing all to the world, well, at least not to everyone. So how did it work? Chamber pots for women were specially designed, not round like the standard ones used by men, but oval with scooped insides to fit snugly between the thighs. A lady would position the pot beneath her skirts. No squatting necessary, just a subtle maneuver under the fabric. Done right, no one in the room would even notice. At fancy balls or social gatherings, whole retiring rooms were set aside just for this purpose. Inside, multiple pots sat ready and maids stood by like battlefield nurses. One would lift the many layers of a lady's gown while another positioned the pot underneath her. Afterward, a quick wipe with a damp cloth, and she was back to the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Not all women had that luxury. For many, the process was simpler and rougher, pot on the floor. Skirts up, squat, and clean up with whatever was on hand, old newspapers, leaves, corn cobs, but don't worry. We'll dive into those charming details a bit later. At the very base of a woman's wardrobe was the linen shift. Soft, washable, and changed often, sometimes daily, sometimes with every new outfit. Maids and servants wore far fewer layers and lived without the luxury of elaborate gowns or private retiring rooms. Privacy in the Victorian world was a luxury few could expect. Modesty didn't apply when nature called. In poorer homes, entire families would relieve themselves in front of one another. There were no separate water closets, no locked doors, just the pot, the floor, or the yard. At high society events, gentlemen would simply stroll into the garden and do their business among the roses. But let's address the gritty part. One question everyone wants to ask, but rarely dares to voice: how did Victorians wipe their bottoms? Brace yourself. One of the most popular tools of the early Victorian era was the dried corn cob. Yes, corn on the cob minus the kernels. It was rotated like a crude roller brush to clean the area. If that sounds primitive, remember these crude implements were reused, cleaned only occasionally, if at all. Another favorite was the sea sponge on a stick. After each use, it was dipped into a communal bucket filled with salt water or vinegar, used again and again. And it wasn't just the Victorians. Early humans wiped with rocks, dirt, and clay, the very earth itself. Comfort wasn't the point. Cleanliness was debatable. It was about doing what had to be done. Other items that were utilized included leaves, straw, and yes, even seashells. You can probably imagine how well that went. As paper became more common and slightly more affordable, Victorians started turning to printed materials, newspapers, catalogs, even magazines. If you ever wondered what happened to last month's issue, it might have ended up in the chamber pot. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't begin to take shape until the late 1800s when patents started to appear. But it wasn't tea until the early 1900s that it was mass-produced into soft-rolled sheets like we have today. Before that, let us just say a trip to the bathroom was not the refreshing experience we take for granted now. So, how exactly did Victorian women manage menstruation in those mountains of fabric and steel-caged crinolines? Well, first, it's important to know that Victorian women had fewer periods than women do today. Why? 3 main reasons. Puberty started around the same time as now, between 12 and 14, but menopause often came early, sometimes in a woman's mid-30s. On top of that, poor nutrition and relentless physical labor meant many women commonly experienced irregular cycles. But fewer periods didn't mean no periods. And when that time of the month arrived, Victorian women faced it without a single pad, tampon, or disposable product. Instead, they got resourceful. Women didn't wear tight-fitting underwear. Their basic undergarment was a linen shift, a long, washable layer that protected expensive dresses from body oils and stains. When bleeding began, they turned to something called the tea bandage. Picture a primitive bikini bottom, tied at the waist and secured with a strip of cloth that ran between the legs. Inside, it was packed with absorbent rags. If a woman was too poor for cloth, she might use moss, sheep's wool, or layers of grass, whatever she could find that would soak up the blood. These rags weren't tossed aside. They were washed, dried, and reused month after month. In fact, women often had to change their tea bandage as many as 12 to 20 times a day, depending on their flow. It was exhausting, uncomfortable, and utterly necessary. On lighter days, some women simply wore thicker petticoats, hoping the extra fabric would catch what needed catching. Later in the Victorian period, split-crotch drawers became common, but they offered almost no real protection. They were designed for ease of bathroom use, not for managing the mess of menstruation. Throughout it all, women were expected to remain graceful, poised and utterly silent about what they were enduring, pain, blood, sweat, and odor all managed beneath layers of silk, lace, and iron discipline. No one talked about these struggles, but every woman lived them. So now, here's the real question. If you had the chance, would you turn back the clock and live like this? Layered in silk and soot, walking through sewage, brushing powder over body odor, and managing periods with moss and rags? Share your thoughts in the comments below.